This video was sponsored by HDpiano. Tritone substitution is typically a technique associated with jazz. However, we can also find tritone subs here. Or here. And even here. So today we're going to learn about tritone subs in all shapes and sizes. But let's start off by explaining what a tritone substitution actually is. A tritone substitution, or just a tritone sub, is when we substitute the dominant chord for the chord that's a tritone away. So for example, if we're in the key of C, the dominant chord is the fifth chord of the key G, G7. So if we substituted G7 for the chord that's a tritone away from G7, which is D flat 7, that is now a tritone sub. So we would take a chord progression like C, G7, C, and we would substitute the G7 for D flat 7. And you can hear that it has a similar character. It resolves in the same sort of way, but obviously with a different flavour. And the reason for that is that the tritone in the G7 chord is preserved. So what do I mean by that? Well, when it comes to a tritone substitution, there's actually two tritone elements going on here. The first is that we are substituting G7 for the chord that is a tritone away. What's a tritone? Well, a tritone is three tones, a tritone, right? So three tones, so that's 6 semitones. So if we go from G, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, doesn't matter if we go up or down, we'll wind up at the same note, D flat. So the first element of a tritone sub that makes it a tritone sub is that we are moving a tritone away from where we started. So now we're building a dominant 7 chord on D flat rather than G. But the other element that makes a tritone substitution a tritone substitution is that G7 and D flat 7 both contain the same tritone. This tritone, F and B. A dominant 7 chord gets its tense sound, its tense wanting to resolve sound from the presence of the tritone that's in that chord. So all dominant 7 chords have a tritone in them. This is D flat, dominant 7, and it has a tritone between the F and the B. And the thing is, two dominant chords that have a root note a tritone away from each other will also happen to have the same tritone within the chord. So D flat 7 has F and B, and G7 has F and B. So when we substitute G7 for D flat 7, that tritone that drives the resolution back to C is preserved. It's still there, making us want to resolve back to C, but rather than the diatonic context of that tritone there with the G7, we get this non-diatonic resolution. And that's why it works as a substitute for the G7 chord. A perfect example of tritone substitution is the classic bossa nova, The Girl From Ipanema. This song has been recorded by loads and loads of different artists. It's one of the most recorded songs of all time, but the original version by Perry Ribeiro features this chord progression. 1 going to major 2, minor 2, 5, 1. Fairly typical. But although this was the chord progression on the original version, most subsequent versions tritone substituted this dominant chord. They swapped the 5 chord here for the chord a tritone away. If you search for the chords or the sheet music of this song, that's the chord progression you will find, the version that includes the tritone sub, despite the fact that this wasn't the original chord progression. It's this use of tritone sub in Girl From Ipanema which almost definitely led to a tritone sub being used here in the Bossa Nova inspired Wii Shop Channel theme that we listened to earlier in the video. Not only is the tritone sub a fairly common tool across all Bossa Nova, but if we look at the melody and the wider chord progression here for the Wii Shop Channel theme, it's almost definitely inspired by Girl From Ipanema. Antonio Carlos Jobim, who wrote Girl From Ipanema, wrote many classic Bossa Novas, another one being One Note Samba. And here in One Note Samba we can once again find tritone subs, and this time it seems that they were here from the very first version of this song, performed by João Gilberto.
Eis aqui, esta minha oferta de uma nota só. Outras notas vão entrar, mas a passa e uma só.
Here in One Note Samba we are in the key of B flat major, so we would usually expect the 5 chord F7, but instead the F7 chord has been subbed. It's been tritone subbed for the chord a tritone away, turning the F7 into a B7. But that's not the only tritone sub in this song. We also have these D flat 7 chords. The D flat here is a tritone sub of G7, the 6th chord of the key. In a more typical jazz chord progression, we would have D minor 7 moving to G7, then C minor 7 moving to F7. 3, 6, 2, 5, a very, very common chord progression in jazz. But by replacing both of these dominant chords here with the chord a tritone away, we wind up with a progression that still functions in the same way, but now has that really silky, smooth movement where the root note just glides down one semitone at a time from chord to chord. We can see the same tritone sub chord progression in the song It Keeps You Running by the Doobie Brothers.
Say where you gonna go, girl, where you gonna hide.
This is also pretty much the progression we saw earlier in Britney Spears' Toxic. Although here we're in the minor key, we are once again getting that movement of the 3 chord down to 2, down to flat 2, which can be interpreted as tritone subs of a 6-2-5 chord progression. Now, of course, this raises the question, did Cathy Dennis and team who wrote Toxic actually start with this chord progression and then tritone substitute their way to this chord progression? Well, I doubt it. It's more likely that they just thought, hey, if we play a dominant chord on the E flat and move it down one semitone at a time, it sounds really cool. I doubt that the word tritone sub ever crossed their mind. And to be honest, although I can't know for sure, I imagine the same is true for Michael McDonald, who wrote It Keeps You Running. But even if these songwriters weren't actively thinking about tritone substitution when they wrote these chord progressions, tritone sub is still a very useful lens through which to understand how these chord progressions actually work. As is the case with many music theory concepts, even if a songwriter doesn't know the name or the idea behind a particular concept, they can still be drawn towards that concept by their ear. Things We Said Today by the Beatles has a great example of tritone substitution, where here in the middle 8, on the first rotation of this chord progression we have the 5 chord E, and then on the second rotation that E has been replaced, it's been substituted with B flat, a tritone sub. And despite the textbook use of tritone sub here, I'm fairly sure the Beatles had never heard of a tritone substitution. Just like how you don't need to know what a tritone sub is to wind up using it in your music, you don't need to know music theory to be able to play the piano. You also don't need to be able to read notation. A great way of learning piano with 0 notation and 0 music theory knowledge is HDpiano. HDpiano offer a massive library of songs to learn, all made accessible by these really clearly laid out tutorials where the tutor talks you through what to do in real time. Learning a song with HDpiano allows you to get that level of detail that just can't be got with just simple chords. You can know the exact voicings, the exact layout and arrangement of the original song, but without having to decode notation and sheet music. If that sounds good to you, then do check out HDpiano using the link down below. I mentioned earlier that it's not just the 5 chord of the key that can be tritone subbed. The fifth chord of the key is what we call the dominant chord, but we can have other dominant chords around the key, i.e. secondary dominants. So what's a secondary dominant? Well, I have a whole video explaining them here, but put shortly, dominant in music just means the fifth chord relative to the tonic. Usually, therefore, we're talking about the fifth chord of the key. But we could have a dominant seventh chord that's a fifth away from one of the other chords in the key. Like we could have a chord resolving us to the sixth chord of the key, which we would call the 5 of 6. Or we could have a chord resolving us to the second chord of the key, which we would call the 5 of 2. So just like how we can tritone sub the fifth chord of the key, the primary dominant, we can also tritone sub the secondary dominants of the key. And because there's basically 5 secondary dominants in each major key, there are effectively 6 possible types of tritone sub that we can encounter. In both One Night Samba and It Keeps You Running, we saw the sub of the regular 5 chord, which gives us a flat 2 chord, and we saw the tritone sub of the 5 of 6, which gives us a flat 3 chord. So those are 2 of the 6 possible tritone subs we can find. What about the other 4? Well, at the start of this video, we saw a clip of Stevie Wonder's As, and here we have a different type of tritone sub. We have the tritone sub of the 5 of 4. Here in As, we are in the key of B major, and the bridge section starts on the 4th chord of the key, which is E. So if we used a regular secondary dominant here to move us to the 4th chord of the key, we would be using the 5 of 4, which in this case would be B7, and it would sound like this. But Stevie doesn't do this. Instead, he tritone subs this B7, the 5 of 4, resulting in a F7 chord. Well, in fact, actually an F9, but it works the same way. So this chord still functions to take us to the 4th chord of the key, but now we can have a slick semitone movement down into the chord, rather than the more typical perfect cadence move from B7 to E. Another song that uses the tritone sub of the 5 of 4, like we have here in As by Stevie Wonder, is Luther Vandross's version of A House Is Not a Home. Here, when it's time to move to the 4th chord of the key, which in this example is the chord F, as we're in the key of C major, we arrive at that F chord via this F sharp 7 chord, the tritone sub of the 5 of 4. And a house is not a home when there's no one there. Now this example is really interesting because Luther Vandross didn't sing the original version of this song. The original version was written by Burt Bacharach and Hal David and originally performed by Dionne Warwick. And that is really interesting because in the original version, this chord hasn't been tritone subbed. It's still the original, the more predictable 5 of 4, the chord C7. So it was Vandross who did the tritone subbing here. When he performed this song, he chose to substitute that C7 chord for the chord a tritone away. A perfect example of a tritone sub in action. So we've seen 3 types of tritone sub so far. We've seen what happens if we sub the 5 chord, what happens if we sub the 5 of 2, and we just saw what happens if we sub the 5 of 4. But what about the 5 of 5? The chord D7 in the key of C major. This is the jazz standard Dream a Little Dream of Me, and currently I have set the tune against the chord progression 1, 5 of 5, and then 5. Stars shining bright above you. But this isn't the chord progression we get in the actual song. What we actually get is a tritone sub right here. So the 5 of 5, D7, has been tritone subbed, turning it into an A flat 7, what is effectively the flat 6 chord of the key. Stars shining bright above you. As you can hear, this chord still functions in the same way as the chord it substituted, i.e. to guide us to the 5 chord, but now we get that signature semitone slide down that all tritone subs give us. So we've now seen 4 out of the 6 possible types of tritone sub we can get. These last 2 remaining types of tritone sub are rarer, but we can still find examples of them. For example, what if we tritone subbed the 5 of 6? So in the key of C major, that chord would be E7, a chord that usually delivers us to the chord A minor, the 6th chord of the key. If we tritone sub the E7, we get B flat 7. And a song where we can see this happening is Let There Be Love by Oasis.
Let there be love.
Now, you might be thinking, it doesn't seem very Noel Gallagher to include a tritone subchord. Well, as Noel explains in this interview clip, he actually learned this chord from Paul Weller.
There's a chord in there that Paul Weller showed me once. I don't know what it's called, but it's I seen him play it one night when he was doing that tune of his, Hung Up. Some fucking weird jazz chord. And I was like, what's that? Show me that chord. And it took me another 8 years to write a song around it.
Sure enough, if we take a look at Paul Weller's song Hung Up that Noel mentions in the clip, we can see the exact same chord progression that Noel used in Let There Be Love.
Hidden in the backseat of my head.
So the last remaining type of tritone sub that we haven't talked about yet is the tritone sub of the 5 of 3. Now the 5 of 3, the chord B7 in the key of C, is the rarest type of secondary dominant, so it follows that this is also the rarest type of tritone sub we can find. And well, in fact, I couldn't find an example. What we're looking for effectively here is in the key of C, we want an F7 chord resolving us down to E minor. That would be a tritone sub of the 5 of 3, but I couldn't find an example of that, so if you can, let me know in the comments down below. As I mentioned before, tritone substitution is a technique largely associated with jazz, and it's in the context of jazz harmony that it makes the most sense. Jazz harmony is driven by the movement of perfect fifths. For example, take this chord progression here, C, A7, D7, G7, an archetypal jazz chord progression driven by the strong resolution of the perfect fifth. It's effectively a journey around the circular fifths. This type of strong perfect fifth movement was inherited from classical music and is essential to how early jazz music works. But later on, jazz musicians wanted to start spicing up these fifth-driven chord progressions. And that's exactly what Tadd Dameron did in 1939 when he wrote the now jazz standard Lady Bird. For Lady Bird, Dameron took the classic typical 1-6-2-5 turnaround of jazz and swapped each of the chords for a chord a tritone away, apart from of course the tonic chord. And that gave him this chord progression, what is sometimes referred to today as the Tadd Dameron turnaround. The Tadd Dameron turnaround was later used in various other jazz standards, for example Half Nelson by Miles Davis. Now, although the purest definition of a tritone substitution involves both the chords being dominant seventh chords, in practice tritone substitution is still used even without the dominant seventh. For example here in the Miles Davis song where these are major sevenths rather than dominants. You can still effectively tritone sub even if the chords aren't dominant sevenths, they just won't have that extra level of interchangeable function to them. So that's tritone substitution. Let me know in the comments if you can think of any other great examples of tritone subs.